Hey, I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to week 207 and video episode number 33 of Music is Not a Genre. Every week I take a release from my collection, I discuss it, I give you my take on it, I talk about some other things that connect and all of that stuff, and I discuss how it has influenced my music. I give you a sample of that and try to connect everything in some ways to everything else. If you like this podcast or the other podcasts I do or any of the music I post on this YouTube page, please subscribe. It would mean a lot to me. It takes a second. You can pause right now, click the subscribe button, and you will get updates on new videos I post and all that kind of stuff. And it's easier to keep in touch, which is my main objective here, is to connect with people, is to create conversations. If you are new to this podcast, as I kind of describe what I do, I started it as a text post on Facebook, over 4 years ago now, might be close to 5. And that's how this can be week 207, even though I only have 33 videos, because this is my 207th post. I always do a text form of this, which I diverge from when I talk, but has the same basic, material. And then a few months ago, I started doing the podcast version of this. I started with my cassette collection and went through all of that. And now I'm going through my vinyl collection, as you can see, and we'll get to that soon. That will be wrapping up, well, I don't know, a few months maybe. And then after that, I'm going to break into my CD collection, which is going to take way longer than both of those, even considering how many I've gotten rid of in the, recent years. So this week, subscribe. Did I mention subscribe? Yes, please. Pause. Stop. No, stop. Take a second. Subscribe. Did you subscribe? Okay, awesome. Thank you. This week, the kind of subject is things that happened before they happened. And I'm using this album as a jumping off point. This is by a band called Pop Will Eat Itself, PWEI. And the album is This Is the Day, This Is the Hour, This Is This. Released in 1989. It's a band that has been around since the very early 80s, a British band. They started off in a different genre, essentially, a different sound, and are still around today in a slightly different form. They certainly took breaks in the interim, especially in the 90s and early O's, but it's cool to know that they're still putting out music and still performing and stuff like that. So the reason why this subject popped up in conjunction with this, and this again was released in 1989, I bought it in 1989, I got into it enough to the point where I actually also have the cassette version of this, which I wrote about partially in a very old post a couple of years ago, pre-video format, is because, so there are always kind of anomalous bands or artists or songs, types of music that pop out during an era when that music isn't around a lot for one reason or another. And I'm not talking about anachronistic music or I guess maybe not, that's not the right word, or music that's kind of retro, like when you had the Squirrel Nut Zippers doing that kind of early jazz sound in the 90s and things like that. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about music that's around that people don't know about because, in a sense, it doesn't exist. And I'm using those damn air quotes for a reason, and that is this. The idea of things happened before they happened is that there's a point at which we, as a person or as a society, become aware of things when they become an actual thing, when enough people, enough media get wind of something happening, they start to talk about it, they write about it, they put a name to it, they put a label to it, they call it something. There's a cultural shift to where, oh, this is something now, like how, grunge took over in the early 90s, and things like that, like how rock and roll supposedly started in the mid-1950s, things like that. Of course, all of this stuff happened before it happened, meaning rock and roll, perfect example, existed before the 1950s. There are songs from the 1940s that if you didn't know what era they were from, you would listen to them and you'd be like, that's a rock and roll song. It's not a proto whatever. No, it's a rock and roll song. There wasn't a lot of that happening at the time. So it was labeled a different kind of music, and it was, labeled, unfortunately, in a racist way. But there were people who still appreciated it and understood it and loved it, though not enough for a consensus to form. So it kind of came and went, or had its pockets of fans and things like that, until it blew up in the 1950s. And there are a lot of societal and race issues involving lots of kinds of music. But if we're talking about rock and roll in particular here, one of the reasons why anything blows up is not just because more people get wind of it and they hear about it. It's also because somebody, some company, some whoever, believe that money can be made from it. And usually soon after that happens, if that music was created by, let's say, African Americans or other ethnic minorities, it is co-opted by the companies and by white performers and all of that. And that is an extremely valid thing to remember, because it's happened over and over and over again. It's something that's still in the music industry and needs to be addressed. I want to point it out because I want you to know that that is part of the narrative and the under narrative, and needs to have more light shed on it. And I will be discussing that actually in a different podcast, my other podcast format, in a couple of weeks. But to make sure you know that there's an awareness of that, but that's not what this subject is about. It's really just about the kind of the music itself. So, right, rock and roll existed before there was rock and roll. It had a different name, it had a different label. It was in a different context. Another perfect example, cell phones. I got my first cell phone in the 90s. A lot of people did. You see old, Wall Street and old movies from the 80s where, rich assholes had their, mobile phones, those giant things. They called them car phones back then. So they existed before then. Did you know that the first cell phone call or mobile phone call was actually made in the 1940s? There was a patent issued for a mobile phone in 1908. So the idea of it has existed for a while. The actual working phone has existed for decades, but it didn't become a thing until it was easier to market, easier to manufacture. More people, heard about it, more money was made from it, et cetera, et cetera. All the reasons. The internet, as you probably know, has been around since the late 1960s. The first rap song, not the 80s. And if you know rap, you will even say 70s, mid 70s. That's close. But the first rap song was in the late 1960s. And there may have been things before then that were kind of like that. But it was listen to Here Comes the Judge. It is an actual rap song. It certainly wasn't called that then. But so what? And consensus formed decade later, rap becomes hip hop, et cetera, et cetera. There are thousands of examples like this, and the thing is, again, it's the commercial success and or media and social awareness of something, or the gifting of a name and a label that becomes legit. That doesn't designate when something came into being. The things happen before they happen, before money gets into the picture, before social and racial things and even just cultural things get into the picture. And so let's get to this band. So Pop Will Eat Itself was a band that started in a kind of a more post-punk feel to it in the early 80s. And by the time it hit the mid to late 80s, it started to do a type of music that was a pastiche of post-punk, indie rock, pop, postmodern. It had a lot of glitch and sampling and some experimenting with sound and things like that. Hip-hop, techno and dance for sure. A lot of electronic drums and things like that, and even metal, even heavy metal. It had elements of it was doing rap rock, new metal before Limp Bizkit and Linkin Park. It was doing sampling and things before Beck and people in the 90s were doing sampling. It was part of the electro-industrial scene, industrial metal and all that, and rock in its own kind of way. which was a scene that existed since really the 1970s, long before it blew up in the 1990s. And when I bought this album, I remember really liking it, like really being into it and really feeling like this was a blast of freshness at a time when you just weren't hearing a lot of this, or I certainly wasn't. And there was some of it out there, but not a lot. And again, that type of music that PWEI was doing didn't really hit the mainstream until the 90s, and so much of the type of stuff they do still exists to this day in some fairly well-known songs and bands and artists. But at the time, even though I was blown away by it and I was just so intrigued by it and immersed in it and all of that stuff for that brief period, I think that I wish I had gotten into them more. I wish I had gotten into them while they were still happening, even before this album and certainly after this album. But I don't think, honestly, that I was ready. Musically, developmentally, I was not ready to absorb all the kind of the intricate layering and style mashing that they were doing. Partly because even then I was a creator of music, and it was overwhelming to me. It was intimidating. There was something in it that I knew I wanted to get to, but I wasn't there yet. Is a good way to put it, I guess. So I kind of abandoned that and was listening to other things for a long time, even though I did punch in and listen to things like Nine Inch Nails and stuff like that, certainly through the 90s. And that idea of electronic and kind of edgy music and funky and all that blending together kind of grew for me over the years. So I don't know that I could say Pop Will Eat Itself was a gigantic influence on me, but it was more of an influence than I realized it until I honestly re-listened to it recently today. And there are tons, there's a dozen or a couple dozen songs of mine that would be a great example of that. But the most recent is off of my band Rex new EP, Syzygy for the Weird, which is everywhere: Spotify, iTunes, here on YouTube, Amazon, etc., Pandora, I don't know, iHeartRadio. And one of the songs on there is called Make Me Mic My Mouth. And I think you will hear that kind of mashup of all the things that or most or all of the things that I mentioned as that Pop Will Eat Itself, PWEI, having in their music in that song. And that's just one example. Are you into industrial music at all? Do you like Nine Inch Nails and things like that? Do you remember PWEI? Do you remember any of their songs? They actually did have some minor hits. They were none big hits, but they had, their MTV play and stuff like that. There was a song, Wise Up Sucker, Can You Dig It? DEFCON 1, I think they were more the bigger ones. A song, a favorite of mine on this album, Not Now James, We're Busy. Funny. They had a lot of humor in their music, which is another thing I like about them and a lot of other bands that I'm into. Not afraid to use all emotions, and to be humorous sometimes. But I think they even had a bigger hit with a song in the 93 or 94, which I would, you're welcome to look up, and I don't remember the name of it. But, point being, they had a nice run there for a few years, and it's music worth getting into if you haven't heard it. Are there trends or musical styles or anything creative or technological or even scientific that you remember existing long before it was a thing? When that thing became a thing and something in your head said, wait a minute, I remember that from 5, 10, 20, years ago. And now all of a sudden everybody else knows about it. Not a bad thing. I'm just saying that's the things that happen. I actually find it cool. So I want to know what you think. I want discussion. Discuss, damn it. That's what the end of all of my texts say when I write out the text of this. Because my objective for all of this and talking about music is conversation and connection. Please subscribe. Please stop right now. Don't listen to me anymore. Just click the link and subscribe, and it would mean a lot to me. And share. And if you like this, or if you find another video you like here on my page, please do share it. Sharing means as much, if not even more, than subscribing. As always, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Thank you for clicking and sharing and subscribing and listening to the music of the band Pop Will Eat Itself. This is the day, it's the hour, this is this. or any of their other albums. Thank you for listening to my music, my band Rex music, my song, Make Me Mike My Mouth. Thank you for clicking on that. And I will see you next week.